there are a couple of things I want to ask about, but let me just think about the ethics of the situation. So you might think some people will say killing animals is just wrong, period. And so that's going to be a problem not just for factory farming, but for anybody who's using animal products or eating meat anyway. Obviously, you don't think that's the case. And so then there will be others who think killing animals is okay as long as it's painless and they've lived a pretty good life, a kind of cruelty-free existence to whatever extent that's possible. Oftentimes, those will be people who go for the non-industrial models that have become popular through the writing of Michael Pollan and the work of Mark Bittman and Joel Salatin and people like that. I think their thought is that, again, the killing itself isn't wrong, but somehow causing pain or harm or suffering to an animal is wrong. And they seem to think that the factory farming model is still ethically more problematic, even if we agree that killing's okay, because there's much more suffering, harm, misery, something like that, in the gestation crates, in the battery cages, in the confined operations. So what do you say to somebody who is worried about that from an ethical point of view?
Okay, let's take both ethics. I mean, clearly there are people who object to killing in all sorts.
Right.
The vegans are being intellectually honest. They're not having anything to do with animal products. Being vegetarian and having that ethic, I believe, is inconsistent in the sense that you still end up with cows giving milk and chickens giving eggs as the most obvious examples. And those animals eventually are either going to have to be killed or dying a natural death, which tends to be worse. Dying is not pleasant. Being killed is generally more pleasant. It's probably an overstatement, but is much less suffering and pain to be killed quickly than to die naturally. And particularly in the wild, where you have animals attacking other animals, sometimes even beginning to eat them while the animal is still alive, the wild is not so pretty. So you have that. The question of animal welfare is, what do you use as a measure? And as a scientist, the measure of it looks good to me is not a particularly sound basis. So one needs to look at the animal and the animal's behavior, the animal's health, the animal's levels of stress hormones, and so forth, and see what the animal is telling us about their condition. And when you do that, in most cases, the animal is telling us they're happy in those horrible-looking cages. They're happy in the gestation cage compared to the alternatives.
So stories about chickens in battery cages going more or less insane because of the way they're cooped up and pecking themselves in damaging ways.
If you go to cage-free, for example, let's assume you accept the inside, but you don't like the cage. Yeah. So this idea of these large cage-free systems is what is one of the alternatives. Well, the mortality rate is actually higher because in the small cage, they set up their peck order. Once they've got their peck order, life is pretty okay.
So it's about 5 of them within one cage.
5 in one standard American cage is fine. And they produce lots of eggs. In fact, they produce more eggs than they do in any other system. You put a 6-bird in that same 5-bird cage, and this is an example of where the industry sometimes looks at just the economics, and economically it made sense. But now all of a sudden production decreased in the sense that the 5th and 6th bird in the peck order were not producing to their potential. And so you have a direct response from the animals that this is not acceptable, even if it makes economic sense. But with 5 birds, they're producing more eggs per bird than any of the other systems. And their mortality is actually lower than, for example, in a cage-free system. So if one of the key ethical points is, does the system kill you? The death rate is the lowest in caged layers for the egg industry. And so these are the kinds of issues. And again, many of these cage-free systems, you have higher mortality, you have higher injury levels for the animals, so they're living with injuries. And they're, from a public health, just to bring that in, and that is ethical consideration, are you helping make people sick
Sure.
as a farmer, is the birds in the cages are being kept out of their feces. They're out of the feces, their eggs are out of the feces. All the other systems, the birds are messing with their feces, their eggs are being dropped in cases where there are fecal matter. What is the wonderful system that you're talking about? It looks good. It is much more visually acceptable to people. And I understand the emotional. It took me a while. I've had to work on saying, wait a minute, as a person, I'm overreacting to what I'm seeing. But if you look at some of the good videos on YouTube at this point, some of the stuff that the meat myth folks are doing and so forth, you will see these good systems, and you will see the animals are there reasonably happy. Yeah, occasionally they'll bite the fence because pigs will bite the fence even if they were in group housing. You know, they have certain behavior characteristics. But they seem to be relatively happy, and they are very successful in going through pregnancy. They get individually cared for because with each animal in a gestation cage, you can see each animal. You can check it. You can make sure it's eating right. You can see that it stands up and sits down, doesn't have a leg problem or anything like that.